Okay, hello, my name is Clara Crawford. This is our presentation over consideration for English language learner evaluations. In our textbook, Chapter 11 focused on assessments for everyone, those with disabilities, those with who are normal on an academic level standard. But Chapter 12 of our textbook really focuses on English language learners and their advantages or disadvantages or what concerns they may run into and what teachers can do to help, what evaluators can do, and other staffs, whether an IEP is needed, whether another form of special education assistance is needed, or whether or not they actually have a disability or if it's just a language dialect that maybe have some confusion there. So, to start off, what is an English language learner? It's also known as an ELL. A lot in our textbook, that's what they refer it to. So an ELL, or an English language learner, is a person who is learning English and whose native language is something other than English. So this could be a foreign exchange student, or someone who speaks Spanish at home, speaks French, or even sign language is another one. So it's just someone whose main dominant language is not standard English. A lot of times this can show some difficulties in the classroom. It may cause a couple issues or different disadvantages for the child. So this assignment is all about how we as teachers and educators can help a student and determine whether or not they need some extra help or not. So the first question was, some people have difficulty in assessments if they are an English language learner. What is your professional opinion on how these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language? So I personally feel is that there is a disconnect between the student and the assessment. Most assessments are written in Standard English Language, or SEA, or Standard American English, SAE. That's what that is. I think there is a lot of loss in translation because a lot of the times when a student or a person is learning English as a second language that is, or something that's not other than their language, a lot of confusion comes into play because English is a really complex language. So I think that some of the issues that arise, that oral language is very different from written language in English. We used to have a lot of slang terms like the cat is out of the bag, or a lot of times we combined things like gotcha instead of like got you, or things like that. And we have text speak, like we have IDK, which is I don't know, or LOL, which is laugh out loud. And English is just something that is so different from others. We have contractions. Did not is didn't. Cannot is can't. And a lot of the times it's really hard to learn all of those. Number two, most assessments, like I said before, are written in Standard American English, which may be different from the English the student is learning. Just like sometimes if you're learning Spanish as a second language, it's not always the same as the native Spanish language that you're learning. So there's like a standard, and then there's like a cultural version of the language, and a lot of that's different. Number three is that dialect is often confused with a language disorder, just because they might have a heavy accent, or they might be a little confused about some words, or they don't get all the slangs or like the catchphrases that we have or idioms. They can be confused with a language disorder. I found this image, and I think it really gives a great example of how confusing English can be. It says, minute and minute shouldn't be spelled the same. I'm not content with this content. I object to that object. I need to read what I read again. Excuse me, but there's no excuse for this. Someone should wind this post up and throw it in the wind. So you see content, content, object, object. The same spellings are said differently, so that can be really confusing when it comes to assessment. My opinion is that I believe English learners are often mistaken for needing special needs when in reality the assessment is just biased towards those who know the Standard American English language more. The second question was, what intervention options are available to students who are English language learners if they need additional services? So I think some of the things that we should be able to provide or give to those who need a little extra service or help is we should make a translator or an interpreter available for assessments, which sometimes there is for things like the ACT. You can even have a proctor if you need it in some special needs cases. We should offer an assessment in the child's dominant or native language. A lot of the times when assessing a student, the first step is to determine if they have a language that is more dominant than English. And if that's the case, they should give that assessment in that language. That way they can get the best and most accurate results on the knowledge that they are assessing. That way the language boundary isn't disabling them in any ways or hindering them in that assessment. Another thing I think we should provide is utilizing small group or partner learning strategies to expose the English language learner to someone who is fluent in English. So surrounding that ELL with someone or students or teachers who are fluent and who know the language really well, they can pick up the slang and they can pick up all the little phrases that we say, and they can help correct the ELL if needed, if they use a word in an odd way or that's grammatically incorrect. And because a lot of the times, just exposure is how people learn. I know a lot of people don't even learn a new language by looking at a textbook or taking a class. They learn by exposure. You pick up things over time, and I think that's really a necessity when it comes to learning English. The last thing that I think we need to provide is some extra time for assessments or other assignments. Sometimes, especially when they're still processing, translating English into, let's say, Spanish, for example. They're translating that English that they're reading or listening to into their own language. So I think just giving them a little extra processing time and stuff like that can help with assessments and other things. What can the teacher personally do in their classroom? They can include their student in their culture, whether that's celebrating certain holidays or their religion or something that is fluent and native to their culture, and maybe having the students who know English really well learning a little bit of this student's language to make them feel included. Model what you are saying and teaching. If you are talking about writing or drawing a square, talk about it and what you're doing while you're doing it. So like say, I'm making one line down, one line to the right with 90-degree angles, and so on and so forth. The next one is to make personal connections and use examples. This goes along with my use pictures or visual aids when teaching bullet over there to the other side. Using visual aids can really help them understand a little bit more. That way they can picture it, because pictures are universal for the most part. And so that's really easy to help make comparisons and connect actions to words. Another one is to make an emphasis on language in all subjects, including mathematics and science. So, like, in math, you can say, oh, well, we're adding, but you also can call it, this is a plus sign, or we're the sum of. So give them synonyms and things like that. And then the last one is to provide a welcoming classroom and collaborative environment. The third question is, why are students who are culturally or linguistically diverse sometimes over or under-identified for special education services? So in our textbook, there are different strategies that they give us and different reasonings for this. The main one I saw was a lack of training for educators, or a lack of staff in general. We all know there's a teacher shortage going on right now, and resources aren't always abundant. Sometimes you got to make do with what you got, and sometimes you get a teacher who may not have the education or the class or the training to help teach an ELL successfully. There's also something called the wait for students to fail approach. It's, well, they're doing fine now, so we shouldn't give them any extra help unless they start struggling in the future, which I think if we get on top of things and we say, hey, we noticed, or we know that you are an English language learner. If you want, we can test you or assess you, and we can see if you need any extra help. That way we can stay on top of it. That way it doesn't become a problem in the future. And then another one is the structured learning and curriculum are not centered around diverse learners. Like I said before, most assessments are in America, especially, are written in standard American English, and it's biased towards those who grew up here, who learned this language, who were in a household who spoke only English, and it can be tricky to identify whether or not an ELL needs special education services or not. Sometimes it's easier for a teacher to just put an ELL in a special education classroom rather than try to work with them in the general education classroom and make modifications there first. So I think that's why sometimes students are over identified for special education services. Being under identified, there is an issue with that as well, because sometimes they're like, oh, well, they're just learning the language, they don't actually need help, or things like that, because the language boundary can really shadow what an underlying issue might actually be. I think that with English language learners, we need to help embrace their language, because if they're learning it at home, it's obviously something that the parents want to keep them with. It's important to their culture, their background, and we wouldn't expect someone who speaks English fluently to learn an entire different language just to be successful in school. So we shouldn't be doing that with other languages either. Proficiency in a language other than English is not a reason for special education services. And I feel like if we did more research, if we equipped our teachers a little bit more, we would be able to provide a much more enriching learning environment for students.